This next session is going to be moving from Google Sheets to data tools. So let's get started. So first, I want to introduce myself real quick. My name is Nathan Moore, and I manage partnerships within our nonprofit practice here at Civis Analytics. Prior to joining Civis last year, I spent 8 years at Every Action, which I know many of you use, where I worked with nonprofits of all sizes on the very issue we're going to be talking through today. What do we mean when we talk about data tools? I think for today's presentation, we really mean this in a really broad sense. Data tools can be data visualization tools you might be familiar with, like Tableau or Google Data Studio, a data warehouse like Amazon Redshift or a MySQL environment, or it could be a Civis platform, which kind of weaves a bunch of those things together. But what this presentation is really about, sorry, my co-presenter, Vinny the dog here, is playing with the curtains. What this presentation is really about is helping you think through why to invest in data tools and infrastructure and how to make the case to your team internally to do so. So a little bit more context setting. We use this slide in a lot of our initial meetings with clients. And what you're seeing here is the analytical maturity spectrum. And this spectrum really represents the progression that just about every organization is hoping to make in becoming more data-driven in their decision-making. This dot on the left side of the screen here represents organizations that are seeking to be more data-driven in their decision-making, but maybe lack the tools and potentially the internal skills to do so. Moving all the way to the far right into the mature section, these are orgs that have fully operationalized data within every part of their organization, from their service delivery to beneficiaries to their fundraising and marketing strategy. And most orgs, needless to say, fall somewhere between these two dots. And our job here at Civis is oftentimes holding hands with clients and walking together from left to right wherever they start on this journey. And oftentimes what that really means is putting better tools in the hands of the doers and the decision makers to carry out their organization's mission. So let's talk about why organizations use Google Sheets or Microsoft Excel to begin with. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that there are many good uses and completely fair uses for these tools. The first obvious advantage is that these are free, easy, and good enough. While Microsoft Excel technically isn't free, it's basically an initial sunk cost for every organization. So it's effectively free to all of their users. And then second, it's really good and effective for presentations, graphing, and other ad hoc analysis that you might want to do. Second, and I think kind of getting in more to the meat of this presentation, I think it's really important to acknowledge that spreadsheets often fill functional gaps in an organization's CRM. And oftentimes, if you think about being a CRM developer, there are trade-offs. Hold on one second, buddy. Get out of there. Sorry, my co-presenter is making a little bit of noise back here. Oftentimes there are trade-offs that developers of CRMs and other data tools make between ease of use and flexibility, especially when it comes to things like reporting. This often leads to functional gaps within a CRM or a database that push users into using Excel for things like their quarterly board reports or other important reporting projects where you want to leverage something like an Excel pivot table. There are also issues kind of building off of that with staff not being maybe optimally trained on using the data tools that are available at their organization. A lot of organizations don't have strict policies around data entry into those systems. And again, that's another thing that pushes staff to leverage free tools like Google Sheets for their data tracking needs. And then lastly, I think this is another really important point to make and gets at the value of a Google Sheet or Microsoft Excel solution. It's that they're kind of like the English language or the US dollar, in that they're used far and wide to communicate data, and they're likely the kind of common denominator that a lot of decision makers and folks within your organization are most familiar with. But of course, with every free solution, there are always the hidden costs. So let's go through what some of those are. One is that it's very easy to make accidental changes in a Microsoft Excel sheet or a Google sheet. All of us, I'm sure, have been working in a spreadsheet and have accidentally deleted a cell or miffed up a formula that's calculating something somewhere. And with limited ability to do version control, you can always hit the undo button or play around with the limited version control they have. It's challenging to preserve the integrity of your data. This can also be challenging if folks are working from data sets that are saved locally on their computer or desktop. So you and I could be thinking we're reviewing the same data, but you're looking at the data from Wednesday and I'm looking at the data from Monday because that's the file I pulled up on my computer. Second, it can be tough to replicate old analysis on new data. So an example of this is if a colleague asks you to pull out a specific segment of your list that lives in Excel or write a query to answer a question within your data. How many gala ticket purchasers also donated, over X amount last year. Those can be complex things to extract from an Excel sheet. And oftentimes data practitioners are really using a query tool or SQL to pull those sort of insights out of their data. If you're able to accomplish that in a spreadsheet, it's really hard to replicate next time you get asked that question. Whereas data tools offer you the ability to save those queries as scripts and then reuse them later. And then really what this GIF here gets at of the man pushing the giant Apple spinny wheel up the mountain here. The biggest issue with Excel is probably that it's slow, especially as your organization gains a lot more data. We recently had a client that we were working with to move their reporting into the cloud that told us, it takes them a minimum of 10 minutes to open their key reports, which I validated myself. It actually crashed my computer. And oftentimes these can actually be impossible to load depending on the amount of data you have and how much computing you're asking that spreadsheet to do. Fourth, reports driven by spreadsheets may only refresh once every week, month, quarter, however often you have the time to refresh them when we know real-time analytics is possible. And then fifth, performing, we talked about kind of the computing power of an Excel sheet being limited, certainly performing what we would call computationally expensive tasks, maybe like pre-aggregating or pre-calculating your data for a donor life cycle report or a lifetime value report. Those are things that can, especially as your data set grows year over year, they can be, frankly, impossible in a free tool like Google Sheets. And then the last point I want to make here, our security team here at Civis would be very upset to learn that this was a throwaway bullet point on one slide of my presentation. We could do an entire presentation on this: security. Obviously, it is not safe to have attached files, particularly if they contain any PII, just floating around your email inbox or your desktop. I think we all see the headlines about increased ransomware attacks. Certainly with the new data privacy laws that are springing up everywhere, there are also financial, real and legal implications for your organization. And certainly any data vendor you work with should be able to articulate to you and provide documentation about why their solution is secure for you and your constituents' data. But, and this is a really important takeaway from this presentation, it's not all bad news. I always kind of chuckle because organizations are always a little sheepish during a discovery process when we uncover that they're using spreadsheets for some important part of their data program. And I'm here to tell you that it really is not anything to be shy about. I encourage folks to think of these spreadsheets as the alpha or beta version of their future data program. Existing reports that you may have in spreadsheets articulate the important KPIs for your organization, and they often have well-documented workflows for creating and distributing those reports to your decision makers and other staff. These are all really important points and positives that form the basis for increasing investment in your data program and the tools that empower that. So let's talk about making the case. What are some advantages to adopting data tools and building analytics infrastructure? I think the top level, most important thing is that data tools should allow you to automate repeatable tasks to achieve that real-time reporting that I talked about. This can free up your time. If you think about all the work that goes into just integrating your systems or just building your Google Sheets or spreadsheets, moving to a tool that automates some of those tasks can free up your time to do more interesting or rigorous forms of analysis and data exploration that we'll talk about a little bit later. Second, data tools should allow you to preserve and enhance your data integrity thanks to things like user permissioning and maybe even hygiene tools that your data tool provider can provide. So an example of this that a lot of Civis platform clients in the nonprofit space use is our tool Identity Resolution, which allows you to centralize all of your data from Salesforce, from every action, other data sources, and it in addition to deduplicating your data and giving you kind of the best possible person record for each person across all of your systems, it also allows you to run processes like a national change of address append, other data appends you may want to run. So whatever data tool you end up selecting, you should definitely ask them about what tools they have available to ensure data integrity and hygiene. Third, in Anna's presentation, we talked about the importance of building a data-driven culture that reaches beyond just the data or IT team. And these tools should allow you to create interactive dashboards that meet the visual learners and doers within your organization where they are, and help you build a data-driven culture by giving people tools that meet their technical capabilities and are optimized for their job. Fourth, another important point to make, particularly for folks on Salesforce, with data tools, there can be fewer limits on data storage. This is, increasingly important, again, as more nonprofits move to systems like Salesforce, where they may only be able to store, 2, 3, 4, 5 years worth of data. Data tools can help house and collect that historical data for, future reporting and analysis. And then lastly, if you pick the right tool, it can be far easier to train stakeholders on using it. Even though Excel and Google Sheets are very easy to being point and click, and again, they're that universal language, I'm sure all of us have been handed a spreadsheet that we now own that was built by some predecessor and programmed with a bunch of their assumptions about what needed to go in the spreadsheet and all of that stuff. And I think with this point, it's also really important that you seek out vendors that really understand nonprofits in particular, so that they can plug seamlessly into your work. So that's something, as we get into the evaluation process, that I would encourage you to ask all of your vendors. So let's talk about that evaluation process. What should that look like? We get a lot of different clients that come in the door here, and there's no kind of one size fits all. Here's how you should run your RFP or your evaluation process. But here are some things we've noticed, certainly from the vendor and partner perspective, clients do that we think is really important. Phase one, documentation. It's really important to write down all of your requirements in one place. This should be an opportunity for you to interview your colleagues across relevant departments in your organization. Write down what is challenging about their job in using data day to day, and begin to kind of put together that collective requirement sheet for your organization. Ironically, Google Sheets is a very useful tool for collecting requirements and sending those requirements to the vendors you want to work with to have them input whether they meet or don't meet individual requirements. But getting back to the point we were making about building a data-driven culture, the process of even undergoing this dialogue with your colleagues will help you gain greater context for their work and the work they're doing, and where they're struggling and using data in their jobs. I would also encourage you, as part of this kind of first documentation exploration phase, to talk to your existing vendors, not only to see what's possible in terms of features you might not be using in your current systems, but to figure out, which cloud data providers or BI tools they have the best integrations with. It's definitely good to consult your existing vendors. And then something we see a lot in the nonprofit space, nonprofits love to talk to one another. Hopefully next year or next summit, we can do this all in person, and there can be a bit more of that kind of face-to-face networking. But I do find in working with nonprofit clients that it's very valuable for them to have dialogue with each other, to hear not only what vendors the other nonprofits are using, but what the pitfalls were and kind of the change management process and all of that. The next phase is discovery. And I think it's really important. We kind of got to this at the opening session as well, but you really need to work to understand whether the data challenges your organization might be facing are solved by software or needing to train and hire the right staff with the right experience. And almost always, it's a combination of both of those things. But some important questions to ask, again, to revisit this, do we have a data analyst on staff? Do we have folks that know SQL? And then once you've kind of answered those questions, I would, strongly encourage folks to, as you'd imagine, come up with a reasonable budget, but share that with the vendors you're working with. And the reason why is that, one, they can tell you, what's reasonable and what's not. And in the case that you are, you don't have the budget to buy the solution you want year one, vendors can often partner with you on kind of a proof of concept project that can maybe be done at a lower price point, but help build the case for other decision makers at your organization that it's worth investing more in your data program and maybe fundraising around that. This is something we do commonly at Civis all the time, and we'd be happy to brainstorm with folks after the session. And then finally, in this final part of this discovery phase, start engaging with your IT team to figure out, if there are certain cloud providers that you should be working with over others, and what the kind of tech, implications are for bringing a new tool into your tech stack. Third, the evaluation. Some people call this the RFP phase. Again, whether you do a formal RFP or not probably depends on your organization's requirements. But this is when you're actually actively engaging with vendors, doing demos, things like that. I think particularly in our space, the nonprofit world, it's important to kind of coach those vendors and make sure that they are talking to your organization both at a technical level, your data and IT teams, but also as you're trying to democratize use of this tool across your different stakeholders, the data problems we're trying to solve should always be translated into plain English for those folks. And I think it's important in working with vendors that you find a vendor that can do that for your organization. Again, you're trying to get buy-in from a diverse staff here, and meeting them where they are on this journey is really important. And then phase 4, probably the most important, don't feel like you have to do everything at once. Identify incremental milestones beginning, 3 months out, 1 year out, 2 years out, ultimately building to maybe 5 years out of how you want to be using data at the organization and what are the incremental steps towards getting there. Virtually every client we've worked with here, we've had kind of this iterative process. And if you're working at an organization where you have that unlimited budget and unlimited buy-in to pursue a giant big data project, you work at a unicorn and you should probably never leave your job. But the last point here is, even as you're taking those incremental steps, don't be afraid to dream big. Again, you're trying to get everybody to buy into what your organization can do by moving off of, spreadsheets or kind of more primitive data tools and onto more advanced analytics tools. And so don't be afraid to always kind of tie the individual steps here back to the bigger picture of what you're going to unlock. So let's talk about what you're going to unlock. This is kind of the hardest part. Once you're a year or two into this, or maybe even at the front end, you're going to get asked how you're going to demonstrate return on investment. And so here are a few of the kind of creative ways that we've seen clients return on or demonstrate ROI from data analytics investments. But I definitely encourage folks to leave comments in the chat too about things that have worked at your organization. The first and easiest way is start by quantifying your time. Start tracking how much time you spend doing data work that maybe isn't anywhere close to your job description. Monitor whether this changes after you've adopted these new data tools. If you can go from 4 or 5 hours a week of ranked spreadsheets to 1, that's a pretty big jump. especially when you extrapolate that over a year. Second, again, utilize features within your new data tool to clean your data. This can have really important downstream effects, like increasing solicitation through better targeting, or just increasing net revenue by reducing duplicate solicitations if you've got a bunch of duplicate records. Building off of that, use these tools to automate segmentation processes that might be really time intensive currently, but could be automated through a data tool to, again, help you personalize your interactions with every donor and supporter of your organization, using things Civis clients use, like save scripts and automated workflows. And then lastly, again, to tie this back to dreaming big, it's really important to highlight the importance of using new infrastructure to build towards other revenue generating activities that you might not be doing. So we talked today about predictive modeling. Something we haven't talked about yet is being able to do message testing within your organization, sort of doing randomized control trials as a more advanced version of an A/B test. These are things that your data tool should be able to enable you to do, and they're things that are pretty easy once you start implementing them to directly tie to hopefully increased revenue for your organization. The last point I'll make on this slide that I skipped over, real-time analytics infrastructure offers the ability to change courses mid-campaign. And a really good example of this actually is from one of our political clients, the Biden campaign. When COVID-19 hit, they had to move all of their voter persuasion, volunteer recruitment, et cetera, from in-person, obviously, as all of us did, to virtual. And they were able to do that, much more effectively because they had an advanced analytics stack that allowed them to move all that reporting from what they were using previously to, their 30,000 person text banking program. That's a process that would have taken months in previous cycles, but thanks to, advances in technology, they were able to make that pivot much more efficiently. And even though I know, we all hope that we won't experience a year like 2020 again, we never know what kind of curveballs life's going to throw at us. And even just adjusting strategy mid-campaign is always an effective thing to do if you get data that shows you things could be working better if you took another strategy. So lastly, thank you all so much for joining this session. I think the three key takeaways from this are, number one, think of your Google Sheets as a useful proof of concept for a mature analytics program. Again, they have your KPIs embedded oftentimes. There's buy-in to these reports being important. So use that as a basis from which to build. Number two, be outcome focused in describing your current goals and current pain points and future requirements. Again, that's getting back to that point of, yes, have your technical and data and IT requirements, but to the extent possible, also translate things so that folks on your fundraising and marketing team can feel represented in your evaluation process and brought into this data program as well. And then third, take incremental steps, but don't be afraid to dream big about what you can accomplish, even if it's years down the road with better data tools. Again, we started talking about some of those neat exploration projects. We'll talk about some cool automations that we've partnered with clients to build out at a later session. There really are a lot of possibilities, and it's important that even as you're going through the slog of the vendor evaluations and contracting and everything, that you keep an eye on that big picture. So yeah, that's my presentation.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Nathan. There was a lot to cover for sure, and I think you really set a path forward for folks to think about how to move beyond Google Sheets and actually into tools. But there are also a number of questions in the chat. I want to make sure that we get to those in the limited amount of time that we have left. Starting with something toward the beginning of the presentation, you spoke about vendors really understanding the nonprofit space. How would an organization determine if a vendor truly understands nonprofit? Yeah, great question.
One way of, I think, getting at that is there is nonprofit jargon. So, the types of fundraising reports, do they use the terms development and direct response in talking about your programs and key outcomes? Are they familiar with just basic nonprofit KPIs like a donor's highest previous contribution. These are kind of little nuanced hints, but things that I think somebody who's sitting at a nonprofit, particularly, these are all fundraising examples, but somebody who's sitting adjacent to or within a nonprofit fundraising program can kind of listen for when they're talking to vendors. And then the other thing, maybe more obvious, is who are your other nonprofit clients and can they connect you with those folks? That's something they should be willing to do as well.
Awesome. And then thinking about going into implementation or even proof of concept, the idea of creating a budget is so central to that. And, there's one thing to be said for this is what is available within an existing pool of funds. There's another thing to be said for someone's going through a budget cycle and they're in the process of establishing a budget. How would someone know the proper amount to allocate for a project?
Great question. And actually something we get a lot of times, the investment that clients are making in Civis platform, for example, this is their first big data project beyond their CRM. And so a question that we get from a lot of clients is, what should I budget? I don't know whether this is a $10,000 problem or $100,000 or less than that. And so a lot of times we're doing discovery in that very, very early, before the client is even ready to go through a demo or anything like that. We're doing some discovery to kind of help them quantify how big the problem is as an input to that next year's budget. So I think it's never too early to engage with vendors and just be transparent and say, we're not looking to do a demo now or even buy anything now, but for the 2021 or 22 budget, we'd like to get a sense of what this investment might cost.
And then in thinking about potentially moving into a proof of concept project, what is a good example of how someone might start with proof of concept?
Yeah, I'll tell you about one we're working on right now, which is this particular client is running a lot of their reporting on a OneDrive Excel sheet. And what they've built out is quite impressive. It's more than just spreadsheets. It's like full dashboards. And so we are, doing a proof of concept project to move that reporting into the cloud, to move some of those reports from spreadsheets into Tableau data visualizations, so that decision makers at the organization can feel like, they have real-time insight. And so just doing like a kind of a lighter weight reporting project like that is a good proof of concept. There are even things like, again, running a message test or building a predictive model, things that Ben talked about during his presentation that can be very lightweight, but again, just show a quick win for what the organization can do if they make this investment.
Awesome. And we are just about out of time, but we couldn't end without seeing your co-presenter.
Oh my gosh. Let me see if I can get him. Benny. He might be asleep. I will, oh wait, maybe here he comes. All right, let's give it a try. Benny. Oh, come on, buddy.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Well,
he's a little shy.
He did make a small appearance earlier. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, Nathan. It's been, I think, insightful. So thanks for your time.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.